The restaurant hummed with the quiet elegance of expensive silverware against fine china. Christopher Holmes sat frozen at his table, the sound of his phone vibrating against the white tablecloth louder than the classical piano drifting from the corner. Around him, couples leaned across candlelit tables, hands intertwined, laughter floating through the air like champagne bubbles. No one looked at the man in the burgundy blazer and wheelchair, positioned carefully at a table set for two. The waiter approached for the third time, his professional smile straining at the edges. "Sir, shall I perhaps—" "Give it 5 more minutes," Christopher said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who'd built empires with words alone. But his eyes betrayed him, flicking toward the window where he'd watched her pause, spot the wheelchair through the glass, and turn away. His phone buzzed again. Not her, just another notification from a world that thought $1 billion net worth could fill the empty chair across from him. He reached for his wine glass with steady hands, refusing to let the other diners see what their pitying glances couldn't quite hide. That Christopher Holmes, the tech genius who'd revolutionized cloud computing before 30, couldn't get a woman to sit with him for an hour. Then a small voice cut through the ambient noise like a bell. "Mommy, he looks sad." Christopher's head turned. A little boy in bright red overalls stood 3 feet away. One finger pointed directly at him with the brutal honesty only children possess. The child's mother, a black woman in emerald green scrubs. Her braided hair pulled back in a ponytail that suggested a long shift, grabbed his hand quickly, her eyes widening in embarrassment. "Alvin, that's not polite. We don't point at—" She stopped herself, seeming to realize any ending to that sentence would make it worse. Christopher felt something crack in his chest, but instead of pain, what escaped was a laugh. A real one. The first in weeks. "He's not wrong," Christopher said, meeting the woman's mortified gaze. Her eyes were kind, exhausted, and completely free of the pity he'd grown to despise. "I am sad, and your son has excellent observational skills." The woman, Yvette, he would soon learn, tried to pull Alvin away, murmuring apologies, but the boy had already made his assessment of the situation. He looked at the empty chair, then at the untouched breadbasket, then back at Christopher. "Are you eating all that food by yourself?" Alvin asked, his small face scrunched in concern that seemed disproportionate to the crime of solo dining. "Alvin!" Yvette's professional composure was crumbling, and Christopher realized she was probably running on fumes, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes from saving lives for 12 hours straight. Christopher made a decision. He gestured to the empty chairs with a sweep of his hand that made his Patek Philippe catch the light, then immediately regretted the flash of wealth. "Actually, it seems wasteful, doesn't it? This table is set for 2, but I'm dining alone. Would you two be interested in helping me solve that problem?" Yvette hesitated, her nurse's instinct to assess and triage clearly working overtime. She was reading him, not the wheelchair, not the expensive watch, but him. Looking for threat, for ulterior motive, for the catch that always came with offers too good to be true. "We couldn't possibly—" she started. "Please," Christopher said, and he meant it. "I'd actually prefer the company, and your son just gave me the most honest interaction I've had all week." Alvin had already climbed into the chair opposite Christopher, his red overalls a splash of primary color against the restaurant's muted elegance. He reached for a breadstick with the confidence of someone who'd never been rejected because of how he looked. Yvette closed her eyes for a beat, clearly calculating whether this was appropriate, safe, sane. Then her stomach growled audibly, betraying her, and Christopher saw her shoulders drop in surrender. "Just for a little while," she said, sliding into the chair beside her son, her scrubs a sharp contrast to the evening gowns and business suits around them. And only because someone decided skipping lunch was a good idea today. "Mommy skips lunch every day," Alvin announced, grabbing a second breadstick. "She says the patients are more important." Christopher watched as Yvette's cheeks flushed, and something shifted in his chest. That same crack widening, letting light in where there'd been only darkness. The waiter returned, saw the filled chairs, and his expression transformed from pity to professional efficiency. "Wonderful. Shall I bring 2 more menus?" Christopher looked at Yvette, then at Alvin, who was already studying the breadbasket like it contained the secrets of the universe. For the first time in 3 years, since the accident that had stolen his legs but not his life, Christopher Holmes felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Yes," he said, "and bring the boy some chocolate milk. That feels important." Alvin's eyes went wide. Yvette started to protest, and Christopher smiled, unaware that the woman who'd rejected him was already forgotten, erased by the presence of a nurse in scrubs and a boy in overalls who saw only a man at a table, not a tragedy in a chair. The waiter disappeared. Yvette was still trying to establish boundaries about what Alvin could and couldn't order, and Christopher made a mental note to leave the most generous tip of his life. Because whoever had stood him up that night had inadvertently given him the greatest gift. The chance to meet someone who looked at him and saw neither his billions nor his wheelchair, but simply a man who looked sad, and Alvin, with the wisdom of 5-year-olds everywhere, had known exactly what sad men needed. Someone to sit with them. Have you ever wondered if anyone could love the real you? Not the version you show the world, but the broken, scared, struggling person underneath. Christopher Holmes sat alone at that restaurant table, watching his date walk away from his wheelchair, convinced he'd never be more than his disability or his bank account. He didn't know that a child's voice, just 5 words, was about to change everything. If you believe real love sees the soul, not the surface, do 2 things right now. Hit that subscribe button and smash that like. It takes less than 3 seconds, and it's how stories like this reach the people who need them most. Then drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love seeing how far across the world moments like this travel. Now, let's begin. Christopher Holmes had always moved fast. Fast cars, faster deals, fastest path to the top of Forbes's under 30 list. Before the accident, his life had been a blur of red-eye flights, conquest-style dating, and the kind of superficial connections that evaporated the moment the champagne went flat. He'd liked it that way. No complications, no expectations, no one getting close enough to see past the billion-dollar smile. Then came that rainy Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. A distracted driver running a red light, the sickening crunch of metal, and Christopher's Ferrari wrapped around a light post like expensive origami. He'd survived with his mind intact, his fortune untouched, and his legs permanently silenced. The doctors called it a miracle. Christopher called it a sentence. The physical therapy had been brutal, but manageable. Rebuilding his company from a hospital bed had been challenging, but he'd thrived on challenge. What broke him, truly broke him, was watching people's faces change when he rolled into a room instead of walking. The pity arrived first, thick and suffocating. Then came the gold diggers, recalibrated, approaching with that special combination of false sympathy and genuine avarice. They didn't want him anymore. They wanted to be seen wanting him. To play the noble martyr who loved the poor, broken billionaire. Christopher had tried traditional dating for exactly 4 months post-accident. 4 months of women who either treated him like a fragile vase or a charity case, who spoke to him in that sing-song voice people reserve for children and the elderly, who touched his shoulder instead of taking his hand. He'd ended it after a woman, beautiful, educated, utterly vacant, had leaned across a dinner table and said, "It's so brave of you to still go out in public." He'd gone home and thrown his phone across his penthouse living room hard enough to crack the screen. The app idea had come to him at 2 in the morning, fueled by single malt scotch and spite. If he couldn't find someone genuine with his money and disability on full display, maybe he could find someone real by hiding one and being honest about the other. It had taken him a week to build the profile. Not on the elite dating apps where everyone knew everyone and net worth was the primary filter, but on something ordinary, where ordinary people looked for ordinary connections. His profile photo showed him from the chest up, professional but warm, the studio lighting soft enough to hide the shadows under his eyes. Under occupation, he'd typed freelance software developer, which was technically true. He did still write code, usually at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. Under interests, architecture, bad science fiction movies, trying to keep plants alive, all true, all deliberately vague. The only lie was in what he left out. Under About Me, he'd written something his assistant had called catastrophically honest. Paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident. Use a wheelchair. Not looking for pity or a nurse. Looking for a partner who can see past the chair. Love deep conversations. Hate superficial ones. If you're here for money or drama, swipe left. If you want someone real, let's talk. He'd gotten fewer matches than he'd expected. The ones he did get fell into 3 categories. Fetishists who had some disturbing fantasy about disability, genuinely kind people who ultimately couldn't handle the reality, and Jessica. Jessica with the profile full of sunset photos and quotes about authenticity. Jessica who'd messaged first, who'd seemed unfazed by his honesty, who'd said all the right things about wanting substance over surface. They'd texted for 2 weeks, real conversations, the kind that stretched past midnight, where she'd told him about her marketing job and her dream of opening a bookshop, where he'd carefully edited stories from his life to remove the private jets and replaced closed $100 million deal with finished a difficult project. When he'd suggested meeting, she'd chosen the restaurant. When he'd warned her again about the wheelchair, she'd sent back a message he'd screenshot. "Christopher, I don't care if you show up on a unicycle. I want to meet you." He should have known better. $3 billion had taught him that people lied, that authenticity was just another brand, that everyone wanted something. But some pathetic part of him, the part that still remembered being whole, being wanted for something other than his bank account, had let himself hope. So he'd put on his best blazer, transferred from his modified Porsche to his chair with the practiced efficiency of 3 years' experience, and rolled into that restaurant believing that maybe, just maybe, someone could see Christopher the man instead of Christopher the tragedy or Christopher the ATM. Then he'd watched through the window as Jessica's face fell at the sight of his wheelchair, as she'd backed away like he was contagious, as his phone buzzed with her lie about a family emergency. Sitting there, surrounded by couples who'd never know what it felt like to watch someone flee at the sight of you, Christopher had decided this was the last time. No more dating, no more hoping, no more pretending that someone might actually, "Mommy, he looks sad." And everything changed. Yvette had learned to read people in her first year of nursing. 12-hour shifts in the ER, taught you who was genuinely hurt versus who wanted attention, who would follow medical advice versus who'd be back next week with the same preventable crisis. But the man in the burgundy blazer, offering his table with the kind of loneliness that radiated like heat, she couldn't get a clean read on him. "Alvin, we need to go," she said, even as her son settled into the chair like he'd been invited to his own birthday party. "We're bothering this gentleman." "You're not bothering me," Christopher said, and something in his voice made her pause. Not the smooth pitch of a man used to getting what he wanted, but the raw honesty of someone who'd stopped pretending. "Honestly, you're saving me from a very pathetic evening of eating alone and overthinking my life choices." Alvin had already claimed a breadstick and was examining the butter situation with scientific focus. Yvette felt her resistance crumbling under the weight of her exhaustion and the very real fact that she'd worked through lunch again, telling herself she'd grab something later, and later had become 7:30 with a 5-year-old who'd eaten nothing but goldfish crackers since noon. "Just for a little while," she heard herself saying as she slid into the chair, acutely aware of how her scrubs looked against the restaurant's elegance. And only because someone needs actual food in his system. "Goldfish are actual food," Alvin protested, but he was already reaching for a second breadstick. The waiter appeared with menus and the promised chocolate milk, which arrived in a proper glass with a paper straw and a level of presentation that made Yvette wonder what kind of restaurant served chocolate milk at all, let alone like it was a craft cocktail. Christopher ordered for himself some pasta dish she'd never heard of, and she chose the most affordable thing on the menu until Christopher gently suggested the salmon was excellent here, his tone making it clear the price wasn't a factor he expected her to consider. "So," Christopher said once the waiter disappeared, "your son mentioned you're a nurse who skips lunch. That feels like it should be against some kind of medical oath." Yvette laughed despite herself. "The oath is about doing no harm. Skipping lunch only harms me, and I'm a terrible patient anyway. My co-workers stage interventions involving granola bars." "What kind of nursing?" Christopher asked, and Yvette noticed he wasn't doing the thing most people did, looking at Alvin while talking to her, or worse, talking to Alvin while pretending to ask her questions. He was looking directly at her, genuinely interested, the way people looked when they actually wanted to hear the answer. "Pediatric ER," she said. "So I spend most of my day with smaller versions of this one," she gestured at Alvin, "except they're usually crying and sometimes bleeding." "That sounds intense." "It's everything," Yvette said simply. "Hard and heartbreaking, and the only thing I've ever been good at that actually matters. Plus, the hours are flexible enough that I can be there when Alvin gets out of school." "Mostly." Alvin looked up from his architectural project involving breadsticks and butter. "Mommy's the best nurse. She fixed my arm when I fell off the slide, and she didn't even cry." "You cried enough for both of us, baby," Yvette said, brushing a lock away from his face. She turned back to Christopher. "What about you? What does a freelance software developer do exactly?" "I barely understand how to update my phone." Christopher's smile shifted, something complicated passing behind his eyes. "I write code, mostly. Design systems that help other systems talk to each other. It's less exciting than it sounds." "Does it pay well?" Alvin asked with the financial curiosity of someone who'd recently learned money bought things. "Alvin!" Yvette wanted to disappear into her chair, but Christopher laughed, that same genuine sound from earlier. "It pays enough, though not as well as being the best pediatric ER nurse, I'd imagine. That feels priceless." Yvette felt something warm settle in her chest. Not pity in his voice, not that careful tone people used around single mothers, like she was fragile or deserving of sympathy. Just respect. Actual respect. The food arrived, and Alvin's eyes went wide at Christopher's pasta, which involved more ingredients than seemed structurally sound. Christopher noticed, and without asking, passed his plate across. "Want to try some? Fair warning, it has mushrooms." "I like mushrooms," Alvin announced, and just like that, they were sharing bites across the table, Yvette's salmon getting divvied up, Christopher's pasta making the rounds, the meal meant for a date that never happened becoming something else entirely. "So the red overalls," Christopher said, "is that a permanent fashion choice or a phase?" Alvin's face lit up. "I have 7 pairs. Mommy says that's too many, but I wear them every day, so actually it's exactly right." "Unassailable logic," Christopher agreed solemnly. "I respect a man who knows what works and commits to it." Yvette watched them, this man in his expensive blazer and her son in his thrift store overalls, discussing wardrobe philosophy like it mattered, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope that the world might contain more good people than she'd been led to believe. Yvette walked out of that restaurant feeling something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Hope that maybe the world still had good people in it. Hope that maybe kindness without conditions still existed. Hope that a man in a wheelchair and a woman in scrubs could share a meal as equals. No pity, no judgment, just genuine human connection. Subscribe if you've ever been surprised by kindness when you expected rejection. If you've ever met someone who treated you with dignity when the world told them you deserved less. If you've ever had a stranger restore your faith in humanity with one simple gesture, like offering a seat at their table when you had nowhere else to go. This channel tells stories about the moments that remind us good people still exist, and sometimes they show up exactly when we've stopped looking. If you believe one act of genuine kindness can change a life, subscribe. Those who think everyone has an angle won't. But you're not one of them, are you? The second time they met, Christopher told himself it was just coffee. A thank you for the unexpected company, nothing more. Yvette had agreed with the same cautious warmth she brought to everything, suggesting a cafe near the hospital where she could meet him during her break. When he arrived 20 minutes early, he found himself wondering if the place was wheelchair accessible, then felt absurd for caring so much about a casual coffee. She showed up in scrubs again, purple this time, with Alvin in tow and marker stains on her fingers from her shift. No makeup, hair pulled back, the kind of tired that came from saving a child's life at 6 in the morning. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Sorry," she said, sliding into the seat across from him while Alvin immediately asked if they had hot chocolate. "My mom was supposed to watch him, but she had a thing and I didn't want to cancel." "And don't apologize," Christopher said. "I like the company, both of you." That became the pattern. Coffee twice a week, always near her schedule, always around Alvin's world. Christopher learned the names of Alvin's teachers, the politics of kindergarten recess, the elaborate backstory of why red overalls were superior to blue ones. He learned that Yvette took every extra shift she could get, that her apartment had a broken heater the landlord kept promising to fix, that she'd been alone since Alvin's father left when she was 6 months pregnant. He said he wasn't ready to be a father, she told him one afternoon while Alvin was occupied with a coloring book. Turns out what he meant was, he wasn't ready to be inconvenienced. Christopher wanted to find the man and destroy him, not with money, though he could have, but with the kind of systematic ruin that would make him understand what he'd walked away from. Instead, he said, "His loss is the world's gain." Alvin's incredible. He is, isn't he? Yvette's smile could have powered cities. I'm biased, but I think I made a pretty good human. By the third week, coffee had evolved into walks through the park. Christopher navigating paths he'd never noticed when he used to jog through in his pre-accident life, Yvette pushing Alvin on swings, all of them feeding ducks that probably didn't need bread but seemed to expect it anyway. Christopher found himself experiencing the city like a tourist, seeing things that had been invisible when he'd moved through the world at the speed of ambition. The community garden where Alvin insisted on examining every tomato plant. The food trucks Yvette knew by name, where she was greeted like family, and the vendors gave Alvin extra napkins without being asked. The library branch where they had story time on Thursdays, and where Christopher sat in his chair surrounded by toddlers, listening to someone read about dragons and feeling more grounded than he had in years. You have a lot of free time for a freelance developer, Yvette observed one Saturday, as they left a children's museum where Alvin had learned everything possible about dinosaurs. Christopher felt the lie stick in his throat. I'm between projects right now. Plus, I work remotely, so my schedule's flexible. It wasn't entirely false. He did work remotely, from his penthouse, managing a tech empire through video calls his assistant scheduled around these moments. He'd started declining meetings, pushing calls to early mornings and late nights, guarding his time with Yvette and Alvin like it was more valuable than the deals he was rearranging his life around. Must be nice, Yvette said without bitterness. I'm lucky if I get 2 days off in a row. Christopher wanted to tell her she'd never have to work another shift if she didn't want to. That he could set her up with enough money to retire, to go back to school, to do whatever she dreamed about during those brutal 12-hour shifts. Instead, he asked, "What would you do if you had unlimited free time?" She laughed like it was hypothetical, which to her it was. Sleep, probably. Then maybe take Alvin somewhere he could run without me worrying about rent. We've never been to the beach, like a real beach, not the lake. I'd like to see him build sandcastles. Christopher made a mental note. Beach house, somewhere private. Somewhere she could rest. What about you? Yvette asked. Before all this, she gestured vaguely at his chair without the discomfort most people carried. What did you do with your free time? Wasted it, Christopher said honestly. Worked too much. Chased things that didn't matter. Thought expensive restaurants were the same as actual experiences. And now? Now he spent Saturday mornings watching a 5-year-old explain the difference between a brachiosaurus and a brontosaurus. Now he knew that Yvette took her coffee with too much sugar and not enough sleep. Now he understood that wealth wasn't in his portfolio, but in the way Alvin grabbed his hand to show him something important. The way Yvette laughed when Christopher made terrible jokes. The way ordinary moments felt extraordinary when shared with people who saw him as just Christopher. Now I think I'm finally getting it right, he said. Yvette smiled, and Christopher felt the weight of his deception like a stone in his chest. Getting heavier every day he didn't tell her the truth. Yvette showed up to coffee on a Tuesday, looking like she'd aged 5 years overnight. No scrubs this time. She wasn't working, which was unusual. Alvin was with her mother. She sat down across from Christopher and didn't even pretend to smile. I need to cancel our plans for next week, she said without preamble, and probably the week after, maybe for a while. Christopher's stomach dropped. What happened? She pulled a folded paper from her purse, smoothed it on the table between them like she was presenting evidence. An eviction notice. 30 days to pay 3 months of back rent plus fees or vacate the premises. I thought I was managing it, she said, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who'd stopped sleeping. I thought if I picked up enough shifts, if I was careful enough, I could catch up. But then Alvin needed antibiotics last month, and my car needed new brakes, and I had to choose between the rent and making sure he was safe, and—" She stopped, pressing her palms against her eyes. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this." "Yes, I do," Christopher said, his mind already calculating. $4,500. That's what the notice said. He spent more than that on wine he never drank. "Yvette, how much do you need?" "I'm not asking you for money." Her hands dropped, and he saw the pride there, fierce and brittle. "That's not why I'm telling you. I wanted you to know why I can't do coffee dates and museum trips right now. I need to pick up every shift available, find a second job, figure out how to—" Her voice cracked. "I need to figure out how to keep a roof over my son's head." Christopher's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, where his wallet held a black card with no limit, where a single signature could solve this problem in the time it took to write 4 digits and his name. His fingers stopped halfway. If he paid it, she'd know. She'd look at the check, see the amount didn't even make him blink, and start asking questions. She'd Google him, something she clearly hadn't done. Assuming Christopher Holmes, the freelance developer, was too common a name to warrant investigation, she'd find the Forbes articles, the tech blogs, the society page photos from his previous life. She'd know he'd been lying every single time he'd pretended $4 coffee was a treat. Every time he'd acted like a children's museum admission was something to budget for. She'd know, and everything genuine between them would curdle into something transactional. But watching her try to hold herself together, seeing the calculations behind her eyes as she mentally sorted through possessions to sell, friends to borrow from, dignity to sacrifice, that was its own kind of torture. "Let me help," he said carefully. "I have some savings." "No." The word came out sharp. "Christopher, you're between projects. You said so yourself. I'm not taking money from someone who might need it themselves." "I don't need it," he said, then caught himself. "Not like you do. Not urgently. I could—" "No," she repeated, softer this time. "I appreciate it. More than you know. But I've been taking care of myself and Alvin for 5 years. We'll figure it out. We always do." Christopher watched her stand, gathering her purse, her coat, her dignity. Every instinct he had screamed to stop her, to fix this, to use the power he'd spent $3 billion accumulating for something that actually mattered. "Yvette, wait," she paused. "What if it wasn't a gift? What if it was a loan? I could draw up papers, make it official, whatever interest rate you want. I can't take on more debt." Her smile was devastating in its sadness. "I'm already drowning. Adding weight won't help me swim." She left, and Christopher sat there with his untouched coffee and his useless fortune, feeling more paralyzed than the accident had ever made him. That night, he lay in his penthouse, 12,000 square feet of imported marble and floor-to-ceiling windows, worth more than most people saw in a lifetime, and stared at his ceiling. His phone sat on his chest. One call to his assistant. One transfer. The landlord's account information wouldn't be hard to find. He could pay it anonymously, make it look like a clerical error, a mix-up, anything. But that was just another lie. Another manipulation. Another way of controlling her life without her consent, even if the intention was good. His phone buzzed. A text from Yvette. "Thank you for listening, and for not making it weird. You're a good friend." Christopher, friend. The word felt like a verdict. He pulled up his contacts, hovering over his attorney's name. He could set up a trust. Anonymous support. Route it through enough shell companies that it couldn't be traced back to him. It would be easy. He'd structured more complex financial instruments before breakfast. Christopher closed his phone without calling anyone. Because Yvette had asked him not to help, and respecting her choice, even when it killed him, was the only honest thing left to give her. He just didn't know how much longer he could watch her suffer while sitting on the solution. How many nights he could sleep in luxury while she figured out which bills to pay and which to let slide. How he could claim to care about her while letting his pride and fear dictate her reality. The answer, he was learning, was not many more. Christopher was drafting the text when Jessica walked into the cafe. He'd written and deleted 17 versions, each one trying to find the words that would make Yvette understand why he'd lied without making the lie worse. I need to tell you something about myself. It's important. Can we meet? Delete, too ominous. There's something I should have told you from the beginning. Delete, too guilty. I haven't been completely honest with you. Delete, too vague. Christopher Holmes, a voice said, and he looked up to see Jessica standing beside his table in designer heels and a dress that cost more than Yvette's rent. I thought that was you. His blood went cold. This cafe was 10 blocks from his usual radius, chosen specifically because no one from his old life would ever be caught dead here. The coffee was good but unremarkable. The clientele working class, the decor functional. It was exactly the kind of place Jessica would have mocked before she knew who he was. Jessica, he said her name like an accusation. I know. She slid into the seat across from him, Yvette's seat, without being invited. I owe you the biggest apology. That night at the restaurant, I completely panicked. I got scared, and I handled it so badly, and I've been kicking myself ever since. Christopher studied her face, looking for sincerity and finding only calculation. Her eyes kept flicking to his watch, his phone, the titanium frame of his wheelchair that cost more than most people's cars. You saw the Forbes article, he said flatly. She had the grace to look embarrassed, but not enough to stop talking. I saw a lot of things, the tech blogs, the investment portfolios. Christopher, I had no idea you were the Christopher Holmes. The app profile said software developer, and I just assumed. You assumed correctly, he cut her off. I am a software developer. I just happen to be successful at it. Successful? She laughed like he'd made a joke. You're worth $3 billion. That's not successful, that's… Christopher, if I'd known, I never would have walked away when you saw my wheelchair. He let the words hang there, sharp and clean. That's exactly my point, Jessica. You didn't know about the money, so the disability was a deal breaker. Now you know about the money, and suddenly the disability is negotiable. Do you understand how insulting that is? Her expression shifted, recalculating. That's not fair. I made a mistake, yes, but people deserve second chances. We had a real connection in our messages. That was real. Our messages were based on a version of me you thought was worth your time, Christopher said. Poor, paralyzed, probably desperate, easy to manipulate, easy to… What was your plan, exactly? Date me out of pity? Feel good about yourself? That's not… She reached across the table, trying to take his hand. He pulled it back. Christopher, I'm trying to apologize. I'm trying to make this right. We could start over. You could leave, he said quietly. Right now, before you make this worse. Jessica's mask cracked, showing the anger underneath. You're really going to throw away a chance at something real because I had one moment of weakness? Look around, Christopher. Look at where you are. Who you're... She stopped, and he watched her connect dots he didn't want connected. You're meeting someone. That's why you're here, in this neighborhood, in this place you'd never normally go to. Oh my God, you're dating someone, aren't you? Someone who doesn't know. Leave, Christopher said, but his voice had lost its conviction. Who is she? Jessica's eyes glittered with something cruel. Does she know you're slumming it? Does she think you're actually one of them, struggling to pay rent and counting pennies? Christopher, that's... She laughed, and it was an ugly sound. That's actually worse than what I did. At least I was honest about my shallow. You're lying to someone, making them think you're equals when you could buy their entire life with your quarterly dividend. Every word landed like a punch, because every word was true. Here's what's going to happen, Jessica said, standing up and smoothing her dress. You're going to think about what I said. You're going to realize that whoever she is, she's going to find out eventually. And when she does, she's going to know you lied to her every single day. She's going to wonder what else you lied about. She's going to leave. She pulled out her phone, typed something, and his phone buzzed with a message. Her number. When that happens, and it will, call me. I'll be waiting, because at least with me, you know exactly what you're getting. No pretense, no lies, just two people who understand how the world actually works. She walked out, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and cheaper truths behind. Christopher sat there, staring at his phone, where his unsent message to Yvette still waited in drafts. Jessica was right about one thing. The longer he waited, the worse the betrayal would feel. Yvette was drowning financially while he pretended to understand budget constraints. She was rationing her pride while he was rationing his honesty. He pulled up her number and typed, "Can we talk? Something I need to tell you. It's important." Her response came immediately. "Can't today. Picked up a double shift. Maybe this weekend?" This weekend. 3 more days of lying. 3 more days of watching her struggle while he played pretend. 3 more days to figure out how to tell her he'd been deceiving her since the moment they met, and pray she'd understand why. Christopher had hosted charity galas before, glossy affairs where the wealthy congratulated themselves for writing checks they'd never miss. This one was different. This one was for pediatric medicine, and he'd spent 3 weeks making sure every dollar raised would go to the children's hospital where Yvette worked. It was, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, an elaborate justification for what he was about to do. The invitation came disguised as casual conversation during one of their park walks. Alvin was occupied with feeding ducks unauthorized bread, while Christopher tried to make his rehearsed words sound spontaneous. "There's this event next Saturday," he said, watching a duck ignore Alvin's offering in favor of harassing a nearby toddler. "A fundraiser thing. For the children's hospital, actually. I thought, if you're free, maybe you'd want to come with me." Yvette looked surprised. "A fundraiser? That's sweet, Christopher. But those tickets are usually expensive. I can't really afford." "It's free," he lied smoothly. The tickets were $5,000 each. He'd bought hers months ago when he'd started planning this moment. It's one of those community events. Local businesses donate food. They do a raffle. Raise money for good causes. Very casual. "Oh," she brightened. "That sounds nice, actually. I haven't been to anything that wasn't a kid's birthday party in years, but I don't have anything to wear to something like that. Even casual fundraisers have a dress code, right?" Christopher had anticipated this. Actually, Funny story. My assistant accidentally ordered a dress for this event. Wrong size, can't return it, and it seems like a waste to let it sit in a closet. I could send it over? If it fits, great. If not, no pressure. The lie tasted like ash, but Yvette's eyes lit up in a way that made his guilt temporarily worthwhile. You don't have to do that, she said, but he could hear the want underneath the protest. It's literally going to charity otherwise, Christopher said. Might as well go to someone who'll appreciate it. 3 days later, his assistant delivered a dress that had been selected by a personal shopper who'd studied photos of Yvette and consulted with designers about what would make her feel beautiful without being so expensive. She'd immediately Googled the brand. Emerald green silk, elegant, but not ostentatious, with a price tag that had been carefully removed along with any identifying labels. Yvette sent him a photo of herself in it, standing in what looked like a small bathroom, the mirror spotted, but her smile radiant. It fits perfectly. How did you guess my size? This feels like magic. Christopher stared at the photo for longer than was probably healthy, his thumb hovering over the reply box. He should tell her now. Text her the truth. Give her time to process before Saturday. Let her make an informed choice about whether to come. Instead, he typed, "You look beautiful. See you Saturday at 7?" Her response came with a string of excited emojis that Yvette rarely used, and Christopher felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Saturday arrived with the weight of inevitability. Christopher had his driver pick up Yvette from her apartment. She'd protested until he'd explained that parking downtown was impossible, which was true, though not the whole truth. The driver had instructions to take the scenic route, to give Christopher time to arrive first, to manage the optics of what was about to happen. When his phone rang and Yvette's voice came through panicked and small, he knew the scenic route had taken her past the red carpet. "Christopher, I think your driver made a mistake. We're at the Westmont Hotel. This isn't... There are photographers and people in actual gowns. This can't be the right place." Christopher closed his eyes, sitting in the venue's private entrance where he'd been waiting. "It's the right place, Yvette." "But you said it was casual. You said it was a community thing." "Christopher, there's a red carpet. There are... Oh my God. Is that the mayor?" "Yvette, I need you to listen to me." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "I know this isn't what you expected. I know I told you it would be different. But I promise you, you belong here. That dress, it's yours. You're my guest. And he paused, hearing her breathing quicken. "I really need you to come inside. Please." Silence stretched between them, punctuated by the distant sound of cameras flashing. "Why do I feel like everything's about to change?" she asked quietly. "Because it is," Christopher thought. "Because after tonight, you'll either understand why I lied, or you'll never forgive me. And I'm not sure which outcome terrifies me more." "Just come inside," he said. "I'll explain everything. I promise." Another pause, then, "Okay, but Christopher, whatever this is, it better be a really good explanation." The line went dead, and Christopher wheeled himself toward the main ballroom where 500 of the city's elite were gathering, where Jessica was probably already circling, where his entire world was about to collide with the small, genuine life he'd built in secret. He'd built an empire on calculated risks. This was the biggest bet he'd ever made, and for the first time in his life, Christopher Holmes had no idea if he was going to win or lose everything that mattered. Yvette stepped into the Westmont ballroom and felt her breath catch for all the wrong reasons. Crystal chandeliers the size of cars hung from vaulted ceilings, casting prismatic light across tables draped in champagne silk. Women in gowns that cost more than Yvette made in 6 months glided past, wearing jewelry that could fund Alvin's college education. Twice. A string quartet played in the corner, while waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that looked like tiny architectural achievements. This wasn't a community fundraiser. This was how the other half lived. And Yvette had walked in wearing a dress she now realized Christopher hadn't accidentally acquired, but had bought specifically for her. Probably spent more on than she'd admitted was even possible to spend on a single piece of clothing. She spotted him across the room, and her stomach dropped further. He was surrounded by people in expensive suits, all of them leaning in like he was saying something important. And for the first time since she'd met him, Christopher looked like he belonged somewhere she absolutely did not. "Yvette," he said, wheeling toward her with relief written across his face. "You came. I was worried you'd—" "What is this?" She kept her voice low, aware of eyes tracking their conversation. "Christopher, you said this was casual. You said, I know what I said." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "Please, let me explain. There's a lot I need to tell you, and I wanted to do it here because—" "Christopher!" A woman's voice, bright and sharp. "There you are. We need you for the donor photos." A man in a tuxedo appeared, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Holmes, the program starts in 10 minutes. You're giving the opening remarks, remember?" Mr. Holmes. Opening remarks. Yvette watched Christopher's face, looking for the denial that didn't come. "Give me 5 minutes," Christopher said to the man, then turned back to Yvette. "Please, just let me—" "I need some air," Yvette said, already backing toward the terrace doors she'd spotted. "I just need a minute to process whatever this is." She escaped to the terrace before he could follow, her heels clicking on marble that probably cost more per square foot than her monthly rent. The city sprawled below, glittering and indifferent, and Yvette tried to remember how to breathe normally. "You must be Christopher's little project." Yvette turned to find a woman in a black dress that looked like it had been painted on, holding a champagne flute and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me?" "I'm Jessica," the woman said, moving closer. "Christopher and I have history." "And you are?" "Yvette." She didn't know why she answered. Everything felt surreal, like she'd stumbled into someone else's life. "Yvette." Jessica tasted the name like wine. "How sweet. And how did you meet our Christopher? Let me guess, he was slumming somewhere authentic, pretending to be normal." "I don't know what you're talking about." Jessica's laugh was crystalline and cruel. "Oh, honey, you really don't know, do you? Christopher Holmes, tech billionaire, Forbes' richest under 40? The man you've been having coffee dates with is worth $3 billion, with a B." The terrace tilted. Yvette gripped the railing, her brain trying to process information that didn't fit with anything she knew. Freelance developer. Between projects. Borrowed dress. All of it recontextualizing in real time. Every moment they'd shared, suddenly suspicious. "I can see you doing the math," Jessica continued, moving in for the kill. "All those times he acted like a $4 latte was a treat? All those park dates and cheap diners? He was playing pretend, and you were his little authenticity experiment. The noble nurse in her scrubs, so real, so grounded. I bet he just loved how you treated him like a normal person." "Stop," Yvette said, but her voice came out weak. "Did he tell you about his penthouse? The one with the view of the entire city? Or his car collection? Oh, wait, you probably think he takes the bus." Jessica leaned in, her perfume expensive and suffocating. "Here's what I can't figure out. Did he ever plan to tell you, or were you just entertainment until he got bored?" "That's enough, Jessica." Christopher's voice cut across the terrace, and both women turned. He'd followed her out, and his face was pale with fury and something that looked like fear. "Oh, good, you're here," Jessica said brightly. "I was just getting to know your charity case. Tell me, Christopher, does she know about the Holmes Foundation? The hospital wing you're naming after your mother? The fact that her entire salary for a year is less than what you spent on your watch?" Yvette looked at Christopher's wrist. The Patek Philippe she'd noticed once and dismissed. She'd seen those watches in magazines, knew they cost 6 figures, had told herself she was wrong about the brand because why would someone between freelance projects wear something like that? "Yvette," Christopher said, wheeling closer, "please, let me explain. This isn't—" "You lied to me." Her voice came out flat, emotionless, because if she let the feelings in, she'd shatter right here on this terrace. "About everything. You let me tell you about my eviction notice. You let me apologize for not being able to afford things. You watched me struggle and you—" The words caught in her throat. "You could have helped. You could have fixed everything with pocket change and you just sat there and watched me drown." "That's not fair," Christopher said. "You told me not to help." I said don't help because I thought you were like me." Yvette's voice cracked. "I thought we were equals. I thought, God, I'm so stupid. You weren't being kind. You were being condescending. All of it. Every coffee date, every museum trip. You were playing dress-up in my life." "No," Christopher said desperately. "Yvette, no, that's not what this was. I fell in love with you. That's why I couldn't tell you. Because I was terrified you'd look at me differently. That you'd—" "Look at you differently?" Yvette laughed, and it came out broken. "Christopher, I don't even know who you are. The man I thought I knew doesn't exist." She pushed past him, past Jessica's satisfied smile, back into the ballroom where hundreds of people who belonged here were drinking champagne that cost more than her groceries. She needed to leave. Needed to get Alvin from her mother's apartment. Needed to go back to her real life where people didn't lie about their entire existence. "Yvette, wait!" Christopher caught up to her at the elevator bank. "Please, don't leave like this. Let me take you home. Let me—" "You've done enough," she said as the elevator doors opened. She stepped inside and he started to follow. "Don't. Please. I can't look at you right now." The last thing she saw before the doors closed was Christopher's face, devastated and alone in the middle of his glittering world. And despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal and the humiliation burning through her chest, part of her wanted to go back. But she didn't. The elevator descended, and with each floor, Yvette felt the fantasy she'd been living shatter a little more completely. Until by the time she reached the lobby, there was nothing left but the truth. She'd fallen in love with a man who didn't exist. And the real Christopher Holmes was a stranger who'd been watching her struggle like it was entertainment. She walked out into the night, still wearing his expensive dress, and flagged down a taxi she couldn't afford. Behind her, in the ballroom high above, Christopher Holmes sat alone at a table surrounded by 500 people, feeling more paralyzed than he'd ever felt in his chair. Christopher sat in that ballroom surrounded by everyone, and he'd never felt more alone. The woman he loved thought he'd been playing games with her life. The truth he'd been terrified to tell had destroyed the only real thing he'd built in 3 years. Subscribe if you've ever hidden parts of yourself because you were terrified the real you wouldn't be enough. If you've ever lost someone by protecting a secret that was supposed to keep them close. If you've ever realized too late that the truth you feared telling was less dangerous than the lie you kept living. This channel tells stories about people who learned that being loved for who you pretend to be is lonelier than being alone. If you believe honesty, even messy, painful honesty, is the only foundation for real love, subscribe. Those who think some lies are worth keeping won't. But you're not one of them, are you? Christopher didn't make it 5 minutes before he followed her. The gala could burn down for all he cared. The speeches could go unspoken. The donors could write their checks without his gratitude. The entire evening could collapse into expensive chaos. None of it mattered if Yvette walked out believing she'd been his experiment in slumming. He caught her at the hotel entrance, the doorman already flagging a taxi. "Yvette, please, 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." "I gave you weeks," she said without turning around. "Weeks where you could have told me the truth. You don't get 5 more minutes." "Then I'll say it fast." Christopher wheeled in front of her, blocking her path to the curb. Behind them, guests were starting to trickle out for air, for phone calls, for drama they could sense brewing. "I lied because I was terrified, not of you knowing I had money, but of you treating me differently because of it." "That's not an excuse. I'm not making excuses. I'm telling you what happened." Christopher's voice carried across the entrance, drawing attention he normally avoided. 3 years ago, I could walk. I was rich then, too, and you know what people saw? A bank account on legs. Women dated me for the lifestyle. Men befriended me for connections. Everyone wanted Christopher Holmes the billionaire, and nobody gave a damn about Christopher, the person. Yvette's eyes were bright with tears, but she was listening. "Then the accident happened, and I thought maybe now people would see me differently. Maybe vulnerability would strip away the superficial." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I got pity. Women who stayed because leaving a paralyzed man would make them look heartless. People who treated me like I was broken in every way, not just physically. They saw the wheelchair and the money. And I was either a charity case or a trust fund to access." "So you lied to me," Yvette said quietly. "Made me think you were struggling like I was." "No," Christopher shook his head. "I never lied about struggling. My struggles just looked different than yours. I let you assume things about my finances because, for the first time in my life, someone was seeing me. Not my bank account, not my disability, just me." "Christopher Holmes?" They both turned. Jessica stood in the doorway, a small crowd gathering behind her like she was performing for an audience, which Christopher realized she absolutely was. "Are we doing this here?" Jessica asked, gesturing at the growing spectacle. "How delightfully common. Though I suppose that's the aesthetic we're going for tonight." Something in Christopher snapped. 3 years of pity, of careful navigation, of swallowing his pride and his anger and his fundamental sense of being seen as less than. All of it crystallized into perfect clarity. "You know what, Jessica? Yes, let's do this here." He wheeled around to face her fully, his voice projecting with the authority that had built boardrooms and commanded investors. "You walked away from me because my legs don't work. That's your right. But you came back when you found out about my money. And that tells me everything I need to know about what's actually broken in this situation." Jessica's smile faltered. "Christopher, I don't think—" "My legs are paralyzed," he continued, and the crowd was definitely watching now, phones probably recording. "But your heart? That's the broken thing. Because you can't see value in a person unless it comes with a price tag. You can't love someone unless they elevate your status. And you're so empty inside that you came to this event specifically to destroy something good because you can't stand to see someone else happy. I'm not the one who's been lying, Jessica shot back, but her voice had lost its edge. You're right. You've been honest about exactly how shallow you are, and I appreciate that clarity. Christopher turned back to Yvette, who was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. But Yvette deserves honesty too. So here it is, in front of everyone. He took a breath, aware that his next words would either save everything or destroy it completely. I fell in love with you the night Alvin pointed at me and said I looked sad. I fell in love with how you treated me like a person, not a tragedy or a transaction. And I was so terrified of losing that, of becoming Christopher Holmes, the billionaire, instead of Christopher, the guy who shares breadsticks with your son, that I convinced myself the lie was protection. But it wasn't. It was cowardice. Yvette's tears were falling freely now, and Christopher couldn't tell if that was good or devastating. I watched you struggle with your eviction notice, and it killed me not to help. But you asked me not to, and respecting your choice felt like the only honest thing I had left to give you. I know that sounds like justification. Maybe it is. But Yvette, everything between us was real. The coffee dates, the park walks, the way Alvin makes me laugh, none of that was performance. That was me finally being myself for the first time since before the accident. How touching, Jessica said. The billionaire found himself by pretending to be poor. Very profound. Leave, Christopher said without looking at her. You're not welcome here. You're not welcome in my life. And if I see you anywhere near Yvette or Alvin, I will make it my personal mission to ensure every door in this city closes in your face. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at the crowd, calculating whether to push back, then apparently decided retreat was the better option. She left in a cloud of expensive perfume and wounded pride. The spectators began to disperse, the show over, though Christopher knew this would be all over society blogs by morning. He didn't care. Yvette, he said, and his voice came out raw. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything. But I need you to know that meeting you and Alvin was the best thing that's happened to me in 3 years, maybe in my whole life. And I'm sorry I let fear turn that into something dishonest. Yvette wiped her eyes, smearing mascara she rarely wore. You should have told me. I know. I would have understood. Eventually. I know that too. Now. She looked at him, really looked at him, and Christopher felt like he was being X-rayed down to his essential elements. The money doesn't change how I feel about you, she said finally, but the lying does. I need time to figure out if I can trust you again. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't goodbye either. However long you need, Christopher said. I'll wait. Yvette nodded, then walked to the taxi that had been idling at the curb. Before she got in, she turned back, Edith. That thing you said to Jessica about what's actually broken? A small smile touched her lips. That was the Christopher I fell for, the one who sees people. Try to remember him. Then she was gone, and Christopher sat alone on the sidewalk outside the most important event of the season, feeling more hopeful than he had any right to feel. 3 weeks passed in a silence that felt like drowning. Christopher threw himself into work the way he used to before the accident, before Yvette, when 16-hour days were aspirational and human connection was something scheduled between conference calls. His assistant noticed, but said nothing. His board noticed and approved. The world noticed he was back to being the Christopher Holmes they recognized. Brilliant, driven, untouchable. He hated every minute of it. The text came on a Thursday morning while he was in a meeting about quarterly projections that would have thrilled him a year ago and now felt meaningless. Alvin wants to know if you still like dinosaurs. He has important updates about the Brachiosaurus situation. Christopher excused himself from the meeting, something he never did, and stared at his phone like it might disappear if he blinked. He typed and deleted 4 responses before settling on, "I'm behind on all dinosaur developments. Would love an update." The reply was immediate. "Park, Saturday, just Alvin and me, no pressure." Saturday found Christopher at their usual bench near the duck pond, arriving 30 minutes early, like a teenager on a first date. When he saw them walking up the path, Alvin in yellow overalls this time, Yvette in jeans and a sweater that looked warm and soft, his chest constricted with something that felt like hope and terror in equal measure. "Christopher!" Alvin ran ahead, launching into an explanation about how scientists had discovered new information about long-necked dinosaurs that changed everything he thought he knew about their necks. "That sounds serious," Christopher said, soaking in the boy's enthusiasm like sunlight after winter. Yvette sat down beside him, close but not touching. "Hey." "He replied, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just full. Alvin ran off to terrorize ducks, and Yvette turned to face him. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." "So have I," Christopher said. "Yvette, Let me go first," she interrupted gently. "I was angry. I'm still a little angry. But I've also been thinking about why you lied, and I understand it better than I did that night. The world hasn't been kind to you. People saw your chair or your money, never just you. And I get why finding someone who saw you as Christopher felt worth protecting, even if the protection was misguided." Christopher's throat felt tight. "I should have trusted you with the truth." "Yes," she agreed, "but I should have asked myself why a freelance developer had so much free time, why your watch looked so expensive, why you knew about wine that cost more than my rent. I think part of me didn't want to know, because I was afraid of exactly what happened, that the fantasy would end." "It doesn't have to," Christopher said quietly. "The money changes logistics, but it doesn't change how I feel about you, how I feel about Alvin, how I feel when I'm with you both, like I'm finally the person I was supposed to be all along." Yvette smiled, and it was like weather changing. "Alvin asked me if you were still his friend. He said friends don't stop being friends just because one of them has more toys. He's a very wise 5-year-old. "He is." Yvette took his hand, and the touch felt like forgiveness. "So here's what I think. We start over. Honestly, this time. You be yourself. Billionaire, wheelchair, terrible science fiction taste and all. I'll be myself. Overworked, stubborn, probably always going to feel weird about expensive restaurants. And we see if this thing between us works when it's built on truth instead of omission." "I'd like that," Christopher said. "More than you know." "There's one condition," Yvette added. "You don't get to solve all my problems with money. We're partners, which means we figure things out together. Sometimes that means accepting help, but it also means I get to help you. Deal?" "Deal," Christopher agreed, though his mind was already on the hospital wing he'd been planning, the endowment for nursing scholarships, the affordable housing project near Yvette's work. He'd just have to present them as partnerships instead of charity. "Though I do have a proposal. Not that kind," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Not yet, anyway. But I'm on release. I'm here funding a new pediatric wing at the hospital. State-of-the-art equipment, family-centered care, the works. And I need someone to run it, someone who understands what families need, who's been in the trenches, who won't let it become another glossy project that looks good on paper but fails the actual kids." Yvette stared at him. Christopher, it's a real job, real salary, real authority. You'd be making decisions about budget allocation, hiring, program development. I'm just the money. You'd be the heart and the brain. He paused. Also, I already bought your building. Your landlord was thrilled to sell. Rents being reduced to market rate for everyone. Repairs are scheduled, and your eviction notice is void. That part wasn't negotiable. I couldn't sleep knowing you might lose your home. You bought my building, Yvette repeated faintly. I bought 15 buildings in that neighborhood, actually. Seemed more fair that way. It's an investment in community development, not charity. That's what my press release will say. Anyway, Yvette laughed, and it sounded like surrender and acceptance and something that might have been love. You're impossible. I'm determined, Christopher corrected. There's a difference. Alvin came running back, holding a feather he'd found and considered treasure. Mommy, can we get lunch? I'm starving. Yvette looked at Christopher. Want to join us? There's this great taco truck near. Actually, Christopher said, I have a better idea. Which is how they ended up back at the restaurant where it all started, at the same table where Christopher had sat alone and devastated, where a little boy had pointed at a sad man and changed everything. The waiter recognized them immediately, his expression transforming from professional neutrality to genuine warmth. Mr. Holmes, he said, and your guests. The usual table? Please, Christopher said, and watched as Alvin climbed into the chair that had once sat empty, as Yvette settled beside him wearing jeans instead of scrubs, but the same essential kindness that had drawn him from the start. The waiter brought chocolate milk without being asked. Alvin requested breadsticks with the authority of someone who knew they'd be delivered. Yvette looked at the menu and ordered the salmon, then looked at Christopher and added, and maybe we share that pasta thing you got last time, if that's okay. More than okay, Christopher said, and meant it. They shared the meal the way they'd shared that first unexpected dinner, passing plates, stealing bites, building something simple and profound from the raw materials of presence and attention. Alvin told them about kindergarten politics with the gravity of someone reporting on international diplomacy. Yvette's hand found Christopher's under the table and stayed there. And Christopher felt the last 3 weeks of silence dissolve into something that looked remarkably like a future. You know what I realized? Yvette said as they were finishing dessert, tiramisu that Alvin had deemed fancy pudding and approved. That night you got stood up. That was the worst thing that could have happened to you, and the best thing that ever happened to us. Christopher looked at his family, because that's what they were now, or what they were becoming, and understood exactly what she meant. He'd built an empire on ambition and code, but he'd built a life on the foundation of a 5-year-old's honesty, and a nurse's dignity, and his own willingness to be seen as just a man. To getting stood up, he said, raising his water glass. Yvette and Alvin raised theirs. To sad men at restaurants, Yvette added. To breadsticks, Alvin contributed seriously. They clinked glasses, and Christopher Holmes, billionaire, paraplegic, man who'd lost his legs but found his heart, felt wealthier than $3 billion had ever made him. The table was full. The chairs were occupied. And for the first time in 3 years, Christopher wasn't lonely at all. Not long ago, Christopher sat at this same table, alone, broken, watching a woman walk away from his wheelchair like it was contagious. 3 years after an accident took his legs, he'd thought that was the end of his story. He didn't know that a 5-year-old in red overalls and a nurse in emerald scrubs would walk up and rewrite everything, that his lowest moment would become the doorway to his greatest love, that being stood up would lead to being truly seen. Subscribe if you've ever been left behind and wondered if better was coming. If you've ever felt broken and feared you were unlovable. If you've ever needed proof that rock bottom sometimes isn't the end, it's just the foundation for something beautiful. This channel tells stories that remind you, your worst day might be the day everything changes. Your deepest loneliness might be one stranger's kindness away from ending. Your story isn't over. If you believe second chances are real and love sees beyond the surface, subscribe. Those who've given up on hope won't. But I guess you are not one of them. Are you?
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.